children, the children of Zion. We have been left here to defend humanity's right to exist. No matter what the machines believe, we belong here, at this place, at this time. And with that, I present this revolutionary love letter to those who came before. Let's go. They call me Speed Rider, but never known Heat Hider. But I'm digital, fighting wars no one's hit to. Matrix Division Network System .2. Called the one, the Neo, the Novice, the Noose. Or Trinity will execute. Between the viral agents flagrant, engaged.
Spoilers, people. It is now. We're going to get our pride on. And we're going to get some interviewing done. And I'm going crazy because of COVID-19, even though I don't have it. My name is Bill, and we have a special guest co-host today. Renee, one of our previous guests, is coming in to take place for Noelle for now. Noelle might come in a little bit later, but we want to get things started. Renee...
I am an emergency holographic Noelle.
Yeah, she is Noelle Light.
Renee in the rage.
Renee is a proposal management specialist at a Fortune 500 tech company, which goes back into STEM. And she is also an author of role-playing games industry for both tabletop and LARP systems. So she understands the insanity many of us go through.
Yes, I do.
Quick plug. I decided not to get rid of the long form plugging of everything because you guys don't really need to listen to it. But I will say, everything you want to know about us is found on our website, xchromosomepodcast.com. That's xchromosomepodcast.com. And if you want to write us, you can write us at xchromosomepodcast.com. I mentioned this at the end of the last podcast with Noelle. We do have a guest. Our guest is Kit Chapman. Kit's a friend of mine and Renee's and Noelle's. But that's why I asked Renee on as the guest host today, because she knows Kit and she likes Kit, and we want to make everybody a little bit comfortable when we're talking about these hot topics of things such as science and LGBTQ issues and various things like that. Kit is a science journalist and the author of Super Heavy, Making and Breaking of the Periodic Table. He's currently pursuing his PhD in history and philosophy of science at the University of Sutherland in the United Kingdom. Now, it's 1 a.m. in the United Kingdom, and he's on with us today. So, Kit, welcome to the pod.
Good morning, good night. I'm not entirely sure what it counts as, but hello anyway.
I want to put Renee on the spot. Renee, have you read his book?
Not yet, but it is in fact on my Kindle. I just got it earlier today. You can find it on Amazon. We'll be providing the link in the show notes.
Yeah, I picked up the book because I wanted to I had to take a couple of lower level science courses, which I hated, because of how it was presented. And I was like, look, I'm a type of person that if you want them to learn about science or anything like that, you need to use it like this. And I had went through and I read his book to basically say, I want to know stories about the science. That's what's going to get me interested in science. And if that interest isn't there, that spark isn't there, you don't want to learn. So, Kit, you travel and you teach, you lecture on science and science communication and science journalism. What's your thought in regards to making people want to learn science?
I think you're absolutely right. I think the story is the key part. One of the things I talk about, because I'm predominantly a chemistry journalist, is the problem with chemistry science communication is usually, you pour two substances together, it froths up and or goes boom, something like that. It grabs your attention. It doesn't stay there. Astrophysics and certain communicators are fantastic at telling stories about where we come from. Biologists are fantastic about relating animals to ourselves and explaining how those go. If you look at a David Attenborough documentary, for example, he's wonderful at relating the animal to the humans. That's what you need. You need that connection. And chemistry has some amazing stories. So I am all for storytelling in science.
What would you say would be a good story about chemistry?
Ooh, what kind of story would you want? Someone dying? Do you want something discovered? Do you want something interesting? Something scary? What do you fancy?
Renee, I'll let you choose the subject matter.
I think Kit might already know which story I want him to tell.
You do. I'll come to that one later. Tell you what, how about I tell you a story about an LGBT chemist who died about 400 years ago in a hilarious manner.
Do it.
So this is Francis Bacon. You've probably heard of Francis Bacon. There's a painter called Francis Bacon as well. This was a guy who was a member of the Elizabethan court in London, and he was a fantastic scientist, and he thought about why we do science. He was one of the first people to think that because you can't see something happening doesn't mean it isn't happening. And that's, of course, very important for things like gravity. So all of these ideas initially came from Bacon, this idea of empiricism being beyond what you can just see and witness. And
It
he
also
wanted
applies
to experiment.
politics.
Absolutely does. He was predominantly gay. He may have been bisexual, but certainly he was gay. And in it was 1625, 1626, something around then. He was riding in his carriage through London. It was snowy. It was a very, very cold day. He got interested in refrigeration, and he thought, what happens if I put snow in a chicken? Would its body live longer? So immediately he ordered the coach to pull over. He got out, went and bought a chicken. They killed the chicken there and then for him. He got out and he started shoveling snow up the chicken's anus. While he did this, got pneumonia and died. So he died stuffing snow up a chicken's backside. The thing is, Highgate supposedly to this day is haunted by a shivering chicken, which everyone attributes to this story of Francis Bacon. So there you go, a little bit of a spooky story, a little bit of a science story, but you'll never look at a chicken another way again.
We're going to get back to Sir Francis Bacon a bit, because that's going to be a part of a larger part that we want to talk to you about. Wow. And he didn't get time to write his peer-reviewed paper about refrigeration, did he?
He didn't get a time to write anything at all. So he just, all of this was lost to science. Shall I go to the story that Renee was referencing?
Sure.
This is going to make your blood boil, but it's the story of a woman called Darlene Hoffman. Darlene is still with us at time of speaking. She's 93 years old, and she suffered the most outrageous sexism you could possibly experience throughout science. When she wanted to switch into chemistry, she was told, "Do you really think that's an appropriate job for a woman?" She said, "Yes, I think it is," and sat through classes where it was just predominantly guys. She got to university at what is now Iowa State. And she was forced to take her father died, and she was going to try and arrange the funeral. She asked if she could move her test date. The teacher made her do the test on the spot. She still got a B+. She graduates and she starts getting a reputation in nuclear chemistry. And she gets a position at a place called Los Alamos, which is a huge facility out in New Mexico. And she arrives there, and human resources say, there must be some mistake. Chemistry don't hire women. Lost. They literally kick her out of the base. She tries every day for about 2 weeks to get into the base, repeatedly told, there is no way you could be a chemist, you're a woman. Don't be stupid.
Oh, what the fuck?
Eventually, she finds her supervisor. Her supervisor gets it all straightened out at a cocktail party, I think it is. And her supervisor straightens it all out and says, look, there is obviously a mistake. Then her clearance mysteriously goes missing. Someone removes her clearance. Darlene Hoffman then calls in the FBI, gets her into the base. All of this takes place over about 3 months. She's literally raging against the system, as she called it, in a building just a couple of meters away from this base. While she was waiting for her clearance to come through, her team, the team that she would have led, discover 2 new chemical elements. She misses out on one of the greatest discoveries a scientist could possibly have purely out of sexism.
What? That fucking sucks.
Oh. I told Renee that just when you think the story ends, it gets even worse. Darlene continues her career. In 1970s, she starts to look for plutonium on Earth. Plutonium doesn't naturally exist on Earth in any large quantities, and because it's too radioactive, it breaks apart.
Right.
Plutonium-244 has a half-life that's really long, several million years. And she thought, okay, there must be a fragment of it somewhere on Earth. She gets this sample of rock, she does the analysis, she sends it over to General Electric because they have the best detection systems. Sure enough, there's a tiny amount of plutonium from when the solar system formed found on Earth. It's the rarest possible discovery you could make. It's astonishing what she did.
Right.
The next 30 years, men have written papers saying there's no way she could have found it. Don't be stupid. This didn't happen. We're not quite done there either, because she later moves to Berkeley. And in 1999, she is running an element discovery team. And sure enough, the computer pings and says, we've discovered element 118. Suddenly, Darlene Hoffman has her element. Only she doesn't, because it turns out a guy actually hacked the computer and faked the discovery. So she is denied 3 element discoveries. And her one discovery has constantly been under attack since it was made in the 1970s. That is the life of Darlene Hoffman. Despite that, she's been a fantastic advocate for women in science. She has constantly gone above and beyond to try and make sure that they're welcome. If a woman can't get a position on a group, she would invite them into her group. And all the while she's doing this, every time she walked into a machine shop, there would be Playboy pinups on the walls. Occasionally, people would change the desktop of the computer to try and intimidate her, putting nudie pics, things like that. She was often referred to as a sweet little lady. So, unbelievable sexism, but a real champion for women in science.
Wow, what the fuck?
Yeah. Sexism, specifically in various forms of STEM, is prevalent even today. It is nowhere near as bad as it has been, but just looking at enrollment programs and how many women specifically quit education programs or careers specifically in STEM because of how they are treated is astronomical.
Absolutely. We have massive dropouts.
Yeah. But at least now it is not to the point where we're literally getting kicked out of where we're working on the first day because there's absolutely no way in hell that we could have been hired. So baby steps, I guess. As a matter of fact, Kit wrote an awesome article about unconscious bias, specifically within the context of STEM. Wrote this back in 2017. Yeah, like 3 years. It'll
something
be
like that. Yeah,
it'll be 3 years to the day. Actually,
in
next
Chemistry
week.
World, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I was looking over that article that he wrote. We'll be putting the link up in the show notes to go through and ping that. It's a good article that he co-wrote with
Manisha Lelouch contributed a little bit to the end of the article. Yeah,
gotcha. I wanted to make sure that we gave all credit where credit was due. If you're sharing a byline, we're going to have everybody on the byline. But yeah, it's one of those things where we went through in March, and we did a subject about women historically in STEM, both women, just regular women, and LGBTQA women. We primarily pointed out with minorities historically in STEM, because our podcast was basically canceled for February, so we couldn't really do much for Black History Month. But the history behind women in the STEM field is amazing when you go through and start digging into what they contributed. But one of the things that Kit had told me about was he was not only does he go through and post stories about LGBTQA in history and STEM, you're working on a project to update Wikipedia for this type of issue.
So a friend of mine, Jess Wade, she's really leading the project, and she noticed that there is a significant bias towards men having biographies in Wikipedia. It's something like only 18% of biographies are of women in Wikipedia. That might be incorrect, something like that. And she wanted to address that, so she would go through and she would do a fully researched article about a relevant, important scientist who should be on Wikipedia, create those bios. What she found was that anonymous users would go through and highlight them for deletion almost immediately, saying this isn't relevant, we shouldn't have these here. It was just a systemic problem. I'll give you one example about an ongoing saga that finally did get resolved. Clarice Phelps. Clarice Phelps works at Oak Ridge in Tennessee. She's a Navy veteran, and she went through the Navy nuclear program. And she was part of the team that discovered element 117, which is tennessine. The most recent element discovered in 2010. And she actually took the berkelium from you got to make berkelium in a nuclear reactor. Took it from the nuclear reactor and purified it. Incredibly complicated thing to do. But then that could be combined with calcium to make this tennessine. and she's the first African American woman to discover an element. I don't know if she's the first black woman to discover an element, because there are several elements. We have no idea who discovered them.
Right.
For example, we don't know antimony, we don't know gold, we don't know. I'll tell you one thing, almost certainly wasn't a white guy. Anyway, and Clarice rightly had a Wikipedia article created, fully referenced, fully detailed. It was deleted twice and once marked as it should never be returned to Wikipedia. It was an absolute scandal, and it finally did get resolved, and the page was finally created, and there it remains. But the fact that she had to have 30 or 40 references, all fact-checked, whereas there's a page of a guy who once played 5 minutes for England in cricket in 1878 or something like that. 5 minutes, and it has one reference, and that page has never been touched. I mean, that tells you a lot.
I just went through and actually, while you were talking, pulled up Jess Wade Wikipedia article, and it actually talks about that situation briefly. I just put the direct link to that subsection of that. But
she's fantastic. I mean, if people are more interested in getting involved in Wikipedia, there is a Wikipedia project called Women in Red. Obviously, when you got a red link, it means that a link doesn't exist. Currently, in October 2014, when they started, only 15.53% of English Wikipedia biographies were about women. As of the 2nd of June this year, it was 18.46%. But that is still a massive gender gap.
So, quick question, more of a clarification. Is that just biographies in general or biographies of figures specifically in the sciences?
It's biographies in general. Biographies on Wikipedia, only 18.46 of them are of women.
That should terrify you, folks.
To say, if you want to get involved, if you Google Wiki Project Women in Red, you can very easily find it, and you can get all the information you need about how to create good quality articles that will stay on Wikipedia.
I just added the link to our show notes, so we could add that to everybody's show notes. So they'll be available when you listen to the podcast for a quick search. So you have to Google it. But yeah, when I remember you talking to me about this project a while back, because you were going to get really invested in it when you were looking for a grant or something like that. While we were
so I was looking at potentially going into a grant to do sort of more journalism into this particular area, because I think it is something that needs to be addressed. As it was, the grant didn't come through, and I started looking at other projects as well and other issues. But it's Jess is really the person who leads this kind of thing, and she's absolutely a star. She actually got the British Empire Medal for her work in doing this, and rightly so.
The British Empire Medal, for those that don't know medals, do you have an equivalency to that, to like maybe some other medal?
So it's every year in the UK there are two periods where medals are awarded. It's the New Year's Honours and the Queen's Birthday Honours. The highest, obviously, is something like you're becoming a Knight of the Garter, but that's when we make new knights, basically.
Right.
And the British Empire Medal is established in about 100 years ago, and it's for meritorious service that is worthy of recognition by the Crown. So in terms of honours, it's not particularly high in terms of them, but still, you're getting an honour. And I think that has to be recognised. It's higher than being mentioned in dispatches, for example.
Right.
But it's not quite sort of, a distinguished cross or something like that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. There are usually, I believe there are actually American equivalents, like specifically presidential awards. However, we probably haven't seen very many of those dispersed specifically with the current administration.
Sorry, I really don't know the American award system.
Honestly, that's totally fine. We can research it at another time. But like I said, there's not really there probably haven't been a whole lot of awards or recognition specifically around scientific research coming from the current administration's office.
And to be quite fair, when it comes down to civilian awards, most people, even myself, don't really know them. So I accidentally put Kit on the spot right there, even though I don't even know a lot of the civilian award type things that go out like that. So
the thing is that there's actually quite a lot of awards that are given to scientists that the administration has no real say in. They probably aren't aware of them. And and a lot of them sort of linger on as well. So, for example, there's a fantastic LGBT scientist called Carolyn Bertozzi. She's at Stanford in San Francisco, and she was given a MacArthur Genius Grant. Basically means you've got free reign to start looking at what you really want to look at.
Right,
She was given that quite a while ago.
I've heard of that.
And so these things sort of do linger, and she still gets funding through that. She created a whole new field of chemistry, something called bioorthogonal chemistry, which sounds really fancy. What it actually means is a way of doing chemical reactions in your body that doesn't interfere with your body. So it's a fantastic and really important field for medicine, for example.
Right.
Yeah, I was about to say, I imagine pharmaceuticals are going to be very, very interested in what comes out of that.
Absolutely, and she does work with, I think she predominantly works at the Howard Hughes Medical Center, as I say, Stanford, and she does terrific work there.
Yeah, for those, we didn't go over this, but Kit went to school and graduated for pharmacy, and then decided to give his life over to media.
I discovered that I absolutely hated being a pharmacist. So
I remember when you made that decision.
Yeah, it was doing my night in. I'm one of those people that I can't just do something I don't enjoy.
Well, that's honestly, I feel you, because when I was starting to do commissions for drawing, while I enjoyed the drawing aspect as a hobby, as soon as I started going through and making money for it, it became a job, and then I started hating it. And
yeah, exactly.
When you hate what you are doing, you just dread every single day. My current job, I don't hate it, but I don't love it either. I can keep my job at my job and keep it in its own bubble, so to speak.
Yeah, I get you.
But
I mean, I'm quite lucky in that I've sort of fallen into things I really enjoy doing.
Yeah.
No, I didn't realize how interesting it was. I mean, fire is weird.
How so?
Really, really weird. Well, fire is actually a plasma. And the point of the flame, most of the flame has got no oxygen in it whatsoever. There's only this tiny amount. But the crazy thing is, we don't know on a chemical level how a flame extinguishes. We have no idea. We don't know what the moment is where a flame goes out and a flame doesn't go out. Talking about like the split second. We don't know, which is mad. We're really interested at the moment, as I say, I've been talking to sort of various experts on it, not only about the sort of stuff that exists in smoke, but right down to if you have the most simple flame you could imagine, which is a methane flame. So carbon, hydrogen burning with oxygen. That can produce over 300 different chemicals. This tiny sort of the most simple reaction you could possibly have with fire. And so you imagine how things change when a forest fire happens, for example. Just the sheer number of different chemicals it can produce. It's astonishing. We're looking at putting out fires using sound. And we have. DARPA in the United States can put out forest fires using sound. The problem is you need it to be about as loud as a 747 landing, and it needs to be at a very, very low frequency, so kind of drubbing sound. But you can put out fires that way.
That makes a lot of sense, though, considering the kind of vibrations that would occur specifically with sound waves through air. So I can imagine just that pushing, and then that creates enough air force specifically to make a fire unsustainable just because of the amount of wind.
This is the one that's really interesting. You can put out fire with electric current, electric field, because as I mentioned, it's a plasma, which means it's got a charge. And so you can actually cause flames to bend and move depending on what the electric field is. They did a paper, it came out of Harvard by a lab guy called George Whiteside, very, very famous chemist in Harvard, and I think it was 2011. And the idea obviously got picked up by Marvel because they then had a superhero putting out one of Lex Luthor's, DC, a superhero putting out a fire on Lex Luthor's plane using electric fields.
That's fascinating.
Sorry, we are going in completely a random direction.
I was about to say, yeah, let's start circling back to kind of what we wanted to discuss as kind of the core of this podcast, which is specifically the LGBTQ community within STEM. In a lot of places, we don't necessarily hear about it because it feels like a particular scientists or a group of scientists, either in a research or a more applied field, more often than not, their sexuality doesn't necessarily come into account with how things are presented. And yet, we see a lot of unconscious bias, specifically in STEM in general, but also in the world, but STEM in particular is where there's been a lot of the research done, not just in an academic standpoint, but also from a private sector standpoint.
There have been. I mean, I think it's a good thing that a lot of research has been done, because it obviously means that people are looking at this problem and thinking, okay, there is a problem. There's all kinds of sort of, as I say, unconscious biases that happen in STEM. Things like just protective equipment not fitting, for example, because it's built for a man, or not necessarily, or not for a woman or someone who's non-binary. To current discrimination, last year there was actually a report done by Royal Society of Chemistry, the Institute of Physics, and the Royal Astronomical Society, and they were looking at how to improve LGBT representation in physical sciences, so things like chemistry, for example, physics, stuff like that, not your gooey biology. And they found that 28% of LGBT plus respondents had thought of quitting in the past year, and 1 in 5 trans scientists thinks about it often. So that's really worrying. They also found that 16% had experienced exclusionary behavior in the past year, up to a third had witnessed such behavior happening. And again, this massively raises, when you look at trans scientists, 1 in 3 said that they had received exclusionary, intimidating, or offensive behavior because of their gender identity or sexual identity in the past year. I can obviously give you all the links to this stuff, but the interesting thing is, well, you break it down by actual sexual identity as well. So in terms of people who found it exclusionary, intimidating, offensive, or harassing, obviously I mentioned the trans community.
Right.
Lesbians much more likely to experience hostile environments than gay men. 22% compared with 15%, 15% for asexual as well, bi, pansexual 18%. So these are not good figures.
No, they're not good figures at all.
It's interesting because this sort of encourages people to remain closeted, which you can understand. I think that's actually one of the key things we're looking at in science at the moment. Funnily enough, I was actually talking to a couple of science communicators about it. When do you come out? Do you come out? I think coming out is a personal choice, and I certainly wouldn't require anyone to come out. There is this idea of being a role model, particularly for the LGBT community in science, because, okay, I can cite you a couple of examples of LGBT scientists, but the problem was because homosexuality in the UK, at least, was illegal. People went to prison. Oscar Wilde famously went to prison. Alan Turing, the guy who invented the computer to crack the Nazi codes, he was chemically castrated for being homosexual, horrible things happened. So there isn't this historic examples that you can show. You can't show a large number of people this is someone you can aim to be, and so there's a big encouragement to try and get people to step forward and come out. That said, I think that it is a personal decision. I completely understand why someone wouldn't do that. I know some very, very high-profile scientists. Obviously, I won't say who I know to be LGBT, and they don't say so in public, and I don't blame them.
Me and Noel had talked about this in that Women's History podcast, because we both found out at the same time that Sally Ride was a lesbian, and we spoke about it briefly about if she was able to come out earlier, what effect it might have had on LBTG youth. But at the same time, she would have probably got blackballed from science at the same time, and it sucks.
I think Sally Ride's a great example because she went through so much adversity in this program because of being a woman. Are you familiar with her role in the Challenger disaster? Not the actual Challenger disaster, but the investigation into it.
No.
Okay, so there was a commission set up to work out why the Challenger built an O-ring, which you imagine is a little circular rubber disc,
right?
Little ring. and that morning it was too cold, and the rubber cracked,
Right.
it broke. That's all that happened. And Sally Ride and a general who was involved in the project as well, they knew that, but they couldn't say it. Sally Ride couldn't say it because she was a woman and she'd be seen as criticizing the government and it would be disaster. The general couldn't say it because he knew, because of top secret stuff he'd seen. And so they very carefully led a physicist called Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize winner. Very, very smart guy. They sort of took him out. They said, hey, look, my car won't start because the carburetor is cold. Oh, it's a cold morning. Isn't that interesting, Richard? And they did all this kind of sort of subtle hinting to him that eventually he worked out what the problem was on his own. And he announced that the O-rings, he actually famously took one of the O-rings, compressed it and put it in a glass of ice water during the committee hearing and pulled it out and then just broke it apart to show why the Challenger blew up.
Is that why he's famous?
Richard Feynman is famous for a lot more, mainly to do with things like quantum physics. He was a fantastic science communicator, but he did work towards the end of his life on the Challenger disaster.
All right, yeah, because I heard that name and I was like,
I mean, he also worked on the Manhattan Project to build the atomic weapons. And,
that's the other name that other place that I heard of. Okay.
He was one of the most successful science communicators of all time. He did this fantastic lecture series. He was like the hardcore physics version of Carl Sagan for a while.
Yeah, my science communicators is basically limited to like Bill Nye and the occasional Neil deGrasse Tyson.
I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Neil deGrasse Tyson, but I kind of get that. I mean, in the UK, we've got a guy called Brian Cox, who I think Brian Cox is pretty awesome. Actually, I really enjoy his stuff.
He's really fascinating, yeah.
Anyway, so that's Richard Feynman. But my point is that Sally Ride couldn't say what she wanted to say. She couldn't tell people this is why astronauts have died, in part because of her gender. So the idea of having to come out as LGBT as well, it's just an extra layer of pressure that, why should it matter? But it does somehow.
And this is literally just another example of why the best approach to feminism, at least in my opinion, is specifically an intersectional one, because there's all these different axes on which these different biases can occur, not just on gender identity, but also on sexuality and race. Kit, you actually hit on it very nicely in the articles that you did on unconscious bias. I actually want to go back to that really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You've spent a lot of time among the research community, specifically around physics and discovering these new elements in research for your book, Super Heavy. Based on what you observed, have you seen any sort of direction one way or another for potentially, have things improved since you've written that article? Have things gotten worse?
Well, recently we had a big scandal in the chemistry community and touched on the physics community, which sort of, I don't know if this improves it or doesn't improve it, but it's worth explaining in full. There is a very famous science journal called Angewandte. It is the German Chemical Society's science magazine. It is probably the third largest in the world. It is hugely, hugely influential. And the opinion, it appeared about 2 weeks ago, was written by a scientist called Thomas Hudlicki. He's based at Brock University in Canada. And he was doing a sort of a retrospective look at this paper that came out 30 years ago to see whether or not organic synthesis, which is the area he works in, had improved. And he had some horrific views, frankly. So I'll give you some quotes that were actually appeared in the paper. The diversity of the workforce. In the last 2 decades, many groups or individuals have been designated with preferential status, in spite of the fact that the percentage of women and minorities have greatly increased. It follows that in a social equilibrium, preferential treatment of one group leads to disadvantages for another. Later on, he clarifies that he's referring to white men in this. White men specifically, actually. The rise in emphasis on hiring practices suggests that even mandating equality in terms of absolute numbers of people is counterproductive, as it results in discriminating against the most meritorious candidates. Such practice affects the format of interviews and has led to the emergence of mandatory training workshops, quotes, on gender equity, inclusion, diversity, and discrimination. Note 2. Note 2 is basically slamming these as not any good. I mean, there are so many different areas you can pick out of this particular paper, and what Hudlicki said. I actually took some of the quotes and I set them against Doctor Doom from Marvel, saying them because that is the kind of level that they're at. He had a diagram which is in the center and a load of different arrows going down, and one arrow, there was one color arrow for positive effect, one color arrow for negative effect. Diversity had a negative impact as far as he was concerned on the field. There was one particular quote which was just astonishing. There was one part where he basically insulted the whole of China, saying that Chinese researchers fake their results because they want to get in Western journals, which obviously offended an awful lot of people for very clear reasons. I'm just trying to find the actual quote about. There was another part where he said that the people had to bow down. An apprentice must bow down unconditionally to their master. Yes. While this effort is commendable in order to increase the participation of women in science, it diminishes the contributions by men. This is an actual quote from the paper. Now, as I say, this went into one of the most prestigious science journals in the world, and the backlash was immediate. This journal had Nobel Prize winners on its editorial board. It had some of the most prestigious chemists in the world. 15 of them immediately resigned, including 2 Nobel Prize winners. Just left. The community was up in arms. On Twitter, it was all anyone was talking about. Editorials were written in Chemistry World. They were written in Science Magazine, which is probably the biggest magazine. Nature got involved as well to tackle this. Immediately, the paper was pulled from the website, and then it was retracted within 24 hours, which is unheard of, really, in terms of a paper. 2 editors who obviously saw this and had passed it through have been suspended, and the 2 people who actually peer-reviewed this, so part of a science paper is that it's given out to someone in your field, and they look at it and go, yeah, this is good science.
Right.
If people pass this paper, they will no longer be used viewers ever again by this journal. So they're taking it very, very seriously. Now, the question is that progress, that this happened at all? Or is it progress that immediately there was a backlash? People didn't go, yeah, he's right. My feeling is actually there is progress, because immediately everyone came out and said, this guy does not speak for me, which is something that you might not have seen 30 years ago. We are seeing that increasingly in science. There is, do you know who James Watson is?
Not off the top of my head.
Not
okay. So the invention of DNA was actually discovered by a woman called Rosalind Franklin, and her research was stolen, and genuinely stolen by a guy called Maurice Wilkins, and it was given to Watson and Crick, who then made the breakthrough. And Watson, Crick, and Wilkins won the Nobel Prize. Rosalind Franklin got nothing.
Wait,
true story.
Let me ask a question. Is this the woman in Baltimore, Maryland?
No, she was in London.
All right, I was thinking about another thing that we spoke about in the podcast that sounded similar. All right, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Anyway, yeah, so Rosalind Franklin, I mean, there's actually a plaque outside the Eagle pub where Watson and Crick's discovery of DNA happened, and Cambridge University students carve and Rosalind Franklin underneath it constantly. Anyway, so James Watson was one of these guys, and I can't say that he is racist. I don't want to libel him. He certainly has said things that are racist in the past. And previously, he was such a high-profile figure, Nobel Prize winner, very, very famous scientist, that people just kind of went, yeah, we don't agree with him, but we keep him around. Now that's not happening. Universities are kicking him out, saying we don't want to be associated with this person. So you are seeing cultural changes.
They're fixing broken stairs.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's not a bad thing. We also see programs starting up, like in the UK, we've got something called Athena Swan, which is deliberately designed a set of standards that university departments can compare themselves against to make sure that they are being an inclusive and diverse place to work, which is fantastic. And it is seeing real change. But even so, there's still a long way to go. There's no question of that. Is it better than it was 20, 30 years ago? I mean, the best example I can give you is at university 20, 30 years ago, there is no way I would have come out as LGBTQ in front of my friends. I didn't. I mean, I can tell you that didn't happen. Whereas today, you look at groups and LGBT communities in science, but also in universities in general, people are much more accepting of that. People are much more comfortable with that. They're having conversations. You're seeing more rainbow flags everywhere. The Royal Society of Chemistry, where I used to work, on Pride, they actually gave out rainbow lanyards for each member of staff, and you didn't have to have them. You can have them as an option. I think probably 90% of staff are still wearing them. It's just been embraced and adopted. So there is definitely a systemic change happening. Is it happening fast enough? I don't know. But 20 years ago, if you told me that gay marriage would have been legal in the UK, I might believe you. In the US, no way. Would never believe you. Here we are.
And this is particularly relevant, and we see this a lot specifically in the private sector, especially in the tech industry. If you were talking about this sort of thing during the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s, it might have been something that was kind of talked about in private, but wasn't necessarily something that was really specifically advertised or advocated for. And now in a lot of these large tech companies, you have employee resource groups specifically for LGBTQ employees. You have employee resource groups for various different ethnicities and races. And they're doing a lot of education for folks who are not part of those communities, specifically to help understand what their point of view is. Something that actually is fairly relevant right now, as of the time of this recording, is for Juneteenth, which is specifically in the United States, the day where basically the slavery was officially abolished.
It was in Texas, yeah. I think it was
specifically in Texas, yeah.
That was Oklahoma, because that was the big issue with Trump.
So that's actually a different thing. Tulsa, Oklahoma specifically was a kind of the hotbed for a lot of Black entrepreneurs during the civil rights era. They basically kind of created their own stock market. So it was less about the actual location of the announcement that Juneteenth specifically signifies, but more the additional significance of the location itself. But anyways, back to Juneteenth. A lot of tech companies are either giving their employees the day off specifically to go volunteer for, Black supporting organizations, or providing lots of educational options through employee resource groups and encouraging employees to limit their meetings for the day, specifically so they can attend these various webinars, listen to various podcasts that are coming out from their employee resource groups. Especially with the recent civil unrest in the US, there's been a lot of conversations about, okay, we fucked up on a huge scale. How can we fix this?
I think that's really important. When we come to tech, things like that, I think Peter Thiel from PayPal is gay, isn't he, famously? So you're looking at one of the big players in tech. He co-founded PayPal in the end of the 90s, where he couldn't, sort of come out and things like that. And so this culture change is fantastic. One thing that's worth touching on with, not just in science, this happens throughout, but it goes back to the intersectionality you're talking about. One problem that I've seen is when it comes to equality, diversity, and inclusion, there's sort of one pot of funding that goes into that. And so I know that certain groups, particularly minority groups, feel very frustrated in the United States in that when funding goes to gay rights groups, for example, gay men, they're seeing the funding go only to white men again. The funding that is being ring-fenced for Black and minority ethnic groups, suddenly it's going to white men. And I can understand that that's a frustration. We need to make sure that people realize that diversity and equality and inclusion has that intersectionality, that there are different groups and these different groups all have different needs.
Yeah, that's something else specifically to point out too, especially in incidences of violence against marginalized groups. You see a higher concentration specifically among trans people of color, specifically Black and Indigenous people of color who are trans.
And it was a trans person of color who founded Stonewall.
Yep. Marsha P. Johnson threw the first brick. So it's these figures that basically are the instigators of what we now consider pride. Something that has come up quite a bit this year, especially around various protests going on, is that pride started as a riot. And a lot of members of the LGBT community who are not people of color are going out there and specifically marching in protest and in solidarity with these groups, specifically in that spirit. And also, I don't know if, Kit, I don't know how much you've been following this, but even just recently, there have been a lot of protections that have been rolled back specifically for trans people around their healthcare.
I have been following it, and earlier this week we had the Supreme Court ruling 6-3, protecting trans and specifically the first Supreme Court ruling, I believe, that specifically mentions trans people, and saying that you cannot discriminate on the basis of sexuality and sexual orientation, and they specifically mention you cannot discriminate on the basis of being transgender.
Yep, and they used the Civil Rights Act of 1964 specifically to apply that, which was really fascinating because it's kind of circling back to a lot of things that are even going on now. A theme that I'm frequently seeing among, feminist rallies and Black Lives Matters rallies is a lot of these folks who have children, who have grandchildren, who are now protesting when they were protested back in the 60s. And the common theme is we still have to protest this shit?
Absolutely. In the UK, there's this bizarre idea some people have that racism doesn't exist in the UK because you don't see it in the same level of it is in the US. It doesn't appear in the same way. Then obviously understanding is the whole concept of microaggressions, for example, and there is absolute racism in the UK, no question. We've actually had our own protests that have supported Black Lives Matter. John Boyega spoke at one of them. He screamed that he didn't care if he had a career at the end of this, which was just beautiful, coming out and
as a follow-up to that, film studios have literally been like, no, dude, you absolutely still have a career with us.
Yeah,
whether it is
right.
whether it's a genuine show of solidarity or corporations realizing what side of their bread what side of bread they're buttered. It's buttered. I can't talk. I promise.
Now you know how I felt at the beginning of the podcast.
Oh, shush! They know what side of the bread the butter is on in this particular case. They have a better understanding of what public sentiment is right now.
A better understanding.
A better butter understanding.
Damn it, Bill. Damn it, Kit. You're not helping. And
okay.
a lot of polls out there have gone to show specifically that the majority of Americans, even if they're not necessarily out there in the streets, they support what the protesters are trying to say. They support that message.
Some people have this bizarre idea that there is sort of a limited capital, if you like, in that that you've got to say, whataboutism, what about us, what about us? You can believe in Black rights and Native American rights and gay rights at the same time. That's okay. You can do that.
Yep.
You should do that.
Absolutely.
In the UK, just to sort of continue on, we've had this big in Bristol, which was built essentially on the back of the slave trade. There was a statue of a slave owner, and he did a lot of sort of charitable works in schools and things like that, but it was all built on the back of slavery. And there was a statue of him in the middle of the town, and people ripped down the iron statue and threw it in the sea. This was a guy
Maps locator has since been moved to reflect the fact that it is now in the ocean.
Get in the sea. And I think he transported 80,000 people, something like 18,000 women and children were thrown overboard or killed. Horrific, absolutely horrific. And people scrawled Churchill was a racist on the monument of Winston Churchill. He absolutely was. There's no question about that. All the records are there. The interesting thing is that the statues were being boxed up to protect them, and the neo-Nazis turned up, the far right, to guard their history and all that kind of stuff. So we've kind of stumbled into the same territory America has been experiencing with the Confederacy movement, to remove statues of the Confederate leaders and to rename bases, things like that, which I support, by the way. And
Amen.
And I think my favorite quote I saw it online that someone said is, "I haven't seen a bunch of Nazis so worked about something in a box since Raiders of the Lost Ark," which is.
Woo!
one of the things that
Kind of sums up the British attitude to this.
One of the things that
tear
I've
'em
seen
down, I mean-
that was like a equivalent is look, you had the Confederacy for 5 years. Pokemon Go has lasted longer than that. Shut your hell.
They've actually mentioned that Nickelback
Pokemon Go?
specifically has lasted longer than the Confederacy.
Nickelback certainly have. I don't know if Pokemon Go has. I don't think Pokemon
Pokemon
Go is
has-
5.
Yeah, it's 2020. It was released like 2015.
Okay, so that's less than 5 years.
So think of it next time
I'm-
for the folks who are getting upset about Confederate statues being ripped down. Just remember, as the internet memes have said, it could have been worse. They could have replaced them with Pikachus.
Gotta
So
hide my
honestly, that
playground
would've been
statue.
Yeah, I'll be perfectly happy with that. I mean, yeah, it's a little bit creepy. The thing is, glorification of the Confederacy didn't happen in the lifetime of anyone who was living in the Confederacy.
No,
This
it
is something
didn't.
that emerged essentially through the Ku Klux Klan in the 20th century.
1904 about from what I was reading earlier.
Yeah, there's that big sort of Confederacy Mount Rushmore thing. There's that big carving, if you know the one I'm referring to. I think that was erected in the 1970s. And this is not about celebrating history or recognizing history. One, why would you want to? Why would you want to say, "Oh, I remember that my great granddad was a racist"? Why would you possibly want to do that? I don't understand that need.
It's states' rights.
It wasn't about states' rights.
I know.
I would apologize to anybody in the South who is listening right now. Bill is from Boston. I was born in Pennsylvania. Noelle is from Ohio. We got nothing but Yankees on this show. Actually, no, I'm not
Correction.
sorry at all. What am I talking about?
Correction. I am originally from New Jersey. I live in Boston.
If anyone wants to say that the
You're still a Yank.
I lived in the
American
South for
Civil
half
War
my
wasn't-
life. So.
anyone wants to say the American Civil War wasn't largely about slavery or slavery was its main cause, then come at me, bro. I really couldn't care less. I'm a historian. I can take it.
So, fun story about that. In my AP history class, they were trying to frame it from an economic standpoint, and nobody in the class was having it. And this was back in 2001, like 2001, when I was taking this course. And this is in high school. It's like, yes, Civil War is about economic issues such as cotton. And everyone's like, and slavery.
Economic
But cotton
issues
and
are
slavery.
the transfer to an industrialized format. I mean, the best way to look at it is if anyone's particularly interested in this and why that's a stupid idea, I would recommend that Macpherson's book Battle Cry of Freedom. It's probably the best one-volume treatise on the American Civil War, and it pretty much debunks that whole idea. I'd also look at something like the Trent Affair, for example, which happened during the American Civil War, which proved that British, who were largely receiving cotton for their mills, weren't interested in your slavery bullshit. In fact, there were protests in... can I say bullshit? Oh, too late. I've already done so.
Absolutely say bullshit.
I've
yes.
said stuff multiple times. You can say bullshit.
Yeah, there were protests and by workers in Manchester and in Lancashire saying we don't want this cotton coming from the southern US because they're racists. There's a lot that's made up of the idea that the British had a military observer at the Battle of Gettysburg that was with the Confederacy. Yes, there was a British officer with the Confederacy at Gettysburg. That is absolutely true. He wasn't there officially. He was basically a tourist. He made his own way there, went up to Confederate generals and went, "Hello, I'm a British officer. Can I come and watch you fight?" And they went, "Yeah," because they were too dumb to realize that it was just some guy who was just chancing it and he wanted a bit of entertainment.
That's amazing.
So absolutely true. You can look it up. The whole idea of sort of large support for the Confederacy, it just did not exist. The Confederacy was never going to have Britain and France come in on its side. That was never going to happen. And they're forgetting, obviously, that Britain had abolished slavery at that point. Although that's kind of a bizarre grey area because actually slavery only was recognised as existing in the UK in 1997. Before that, we didn't have slaves, apparently.
Uh-huh.
Exactly. That's why William Wilberforce and all this kind of work was done to emancipate. It's an icky part of history, and to be honest with you, Britain still hasn't really come to terms with it.
America still hasn't really come to terms with it. We're trying, but we still haven't come to terms with it.
Basically, we are 50 years in to trying to repair things that are literally 400 years in the making.
Yep.
Speaking of history, Kit, you mentioned that you're getting your PhD in history and philosophy of science. What specific topic are you covering as part of your PhD?
So my specific topic is what I call transuranic elements. So these are elements that don't exist on Earth. They're things like plutonium, and it's why we created them and why we were looking for them during the Cold War. That's specifically why. And the answer is atomic weapons. That's basically why we were doing it. But actually, we got a whole lot of useful stuff out of it that we would never have otherwise. In your house, you probably have one of these highly radioactive elements that don't exist on Earth. In every smoke detector is a little bit of something called americium.
Yep.
It's element 25, and it does not exist on Earth. We have to make it. So it is a building block of the universe that we have made and created to save your life.
That was an episode of the show Young Sheldon when Young Sheldon was trying to make a nuclear generator to power his house.
Which is fine. And to be honest with you, I mean, there's an episode of The Big Bang Theory where Sheldon actually discovers element 119, I think it is, which we haven't done yet. We're still looking for it. So
that got debunked in the
maybe
show
we can get
too.
some help. I'm sure Jim Parsons can do some calculations.
I'm sure he can. Didn't he get married? Doesn't he have a very nice husband?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I think he's got a nice husband, something like that. Yeah.
Because I remember his coming out was so nonchalant that basically
It's Jim Parsons.
Yeah, basically there was an article that's like, and then Jim Parsons' fiance showed up to give him a drink, and he left, and that was it.
And
True story. About 2 years back, I was having a beer in a place called Lindau in Germany. I was just hanging out, and a guy sat down opposite me, and it was George Smoot. George Smoot is a Big Bang expert. He is the Big Bang expert. Won the Nobel Prize for it, and he appeared on The Big Bang Theory as himself. He's Sheldon's idol. And so I'm sat there. He's having a beer. I'm having a Coke, and we chat for about an hour over sticky ribs, have a laugh, all kinds of stuff we talk about. And what I didn't realize was that he hired Beyonce's assistant so that he could get her Hollywood connections, so she could get him on The Big Bang Theory. True story. Anyway, on.
that works.
Sorry, I thought Renee was going to say something. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Actually, I do kind of have a thought that's a little bit tangential to this, but also vaguely related. Is just how the culture around celebrities, just in general, coming out has just changed so much. We remember back in, I think it was like the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, specifically with Ellen DeGeneres, having her character on the sitcom come out as a lesbian, and then also have Ellen DeGeneres herself come out as a lesbian at roughly the same time. And there is such a big scandal and hubbub and to-do about it. But now, these days, we have situations like Jim Parsons where, his fiance shows up, gives him a drink, and then, we call it a day. Or, folks getting married to their longtime partners, finally, because they'd just been together for decades. And, when same-sex marriage became legal, there was like, finally, we can actually do the thing we've been you can actually have the legal truth you've already been living for decades.
Liberace famously sued newspapers for saying he was homosexual and won. Liberace, come on, Liberace, a fantastically camp performer, and I appreciate that just being camp doesn't necessarily mean that you are homosexual, but he didn't hide it, and he brought his partner on stage and things like that. So the idea that we've moved to then this shock of people coming out, but now it not being a big thing at all. I remember in the UK, I don't know if you're familiar with him. There's a guy called Darren Brown who's a magician.
I love him. He's amazing. He's fantastic.
He's terrific, and he came out. And afterwards, he said one thing that surprised me is that nobody cared. And was like, oh, okay. Right. It was this big thing that was sort of boiling up inside me, and then you pop the balloon, and no one cares.
Yeah, and that is more of the reaction that's coming out these days. It's like that sexuality other than heterosexuality is becoming less taboo, and actually something that has come up a lot in my own experience is specifically the role of the AIDS crisis and how it set back progress to LGBTQ acceptance literally decades, because there was this giant scare about this disease that was, supposedly the gay disease. When you were going into like the late 70s, early 80s, we were in a place where if things had progressed from there, same-sex marriage would probably have been legal in like a decade sooner, if not more. And then suddenly there's this huge stigma around homosexuality because of the AIDS crisis.
I mean, I think that there is no question that the AIDS epidemic had a massive impact, particularly because it was badged as this, it was the gay disease. And there was stories of people having friends dying and no one speaking about it. There was recently a very prominent campaigner during the AIDS crisis who passed away, and who did fantastic work in New York. Very, very aggressive, but he needed to be aggressive because he needed to get the message out there. But when you look into the history of it, the fact that homosexuality was considered a mental illness by the American Psychiatric Association, which writes the book on these things. And it was only really in the 1970s that they actually changed the definitions and said, no, homosexuality is not a mental illness. I believe it was 1973, something like that. And interestingly enough, the psychiatrist who proposed it was gay and hadn't come out because he couldn't. But yeah, it was removed officially in 1973 and then never appeared again in 1974. It was just gone. So the idea that we've gone from this idea of it being a mental illness through to making massive progress, having it dented by AIDS, having it that massive delay, which cost lives. I mean, let's be honest here. People died because of that, and still die to this day. South Africa, for example, has inequalities, particularly in the LGBT community, but also sort of in the wider communities as well. And the misinformation, they had a president called Jacob Zuma. I don't know if you're too familiar with Zuma. He was there's a lot of tribal politics essentially in South African politics, and so he was largely impervious because he was a chief and he said vote for me, and so people voted for him. He said that he had sex with a woman who had AIDS, but he was cured because he had a shower afterwards. This was the president of South Africa saying it. So there's this huge problem in South Africa. The figures that they actually have of prevalence of AIDS in South Africa, and particularly the country South Africa, but also the region South Africa, is astonishing and scary. And these are some of the most impoverished countries in the world. Yeah,
and not only that, but because of various mindsets, whether they're tribal or they're coming from, colonizer missionaries, what have you, the ideas about the LGBT community in general, specifically in Africa, is still significantly behind what we would consider more developed countries or more white countries. Let's be honest here. One of the programs that I volunteer with out in tech specifically has tech workers in the LGBT community helping out with organizations for the LGBT community in Africa, like helping them set up websites or additional outreach programs, what have you, basically putting their skills to use for these places that don't necessarily have the same technical resources or that kind of knowledge. So it's really kind of, you see that a lot, and it's a little scary. I personally helped build a site for an LGBTQ group in Rwanda, and their initial website was literally out of 1995. We were able to convert them to a WordPress site that was a lot cleaner, had a much better interface, and I offered to help them with, any sort of additional tech support after that. They've never gotten back to me, and I followed up and they're doing just fine. But those are the kind of resources that groups like that need specifically to, well, in a word, catch up. And that's not even talking about legislation. That's just talking general culture and giving these groups just a place to be themselves and to have that kind of solidarity with people like them.
I was just doing a quick fact check while I have a look around it. So Jacob Zuma, I don't think he was actually a chief, but he certainly had a large power block because of his Zulu heritage. So I just want to clarify that. But yeah, he's. I was going to say, while I was looking at it, it's quite interesting. His middle name translates as "one who smiles while causing you harm," which is a staggeringly amazing middle name.
Wait,
is
his
terrifying.
name was Umbridge? Baboonch.
Oh, of course
I-
we're working the Harry Potter fandom in here because Bill is in the
Oh,
room.
No,
Is it a
no,
Harry
no,
Potter joke?
I was working the X angle, so
That's fair.
I have no idea what whatever you said was. I am not familiar with the Harry Potter books.
it's a horrible character in the books, written by a horrible person, but I put it onto the name of a horrible person in real life to wipe them out of memory. So
And because we have a lot of American listeners, yes, there's in fact a British person who doesn't know what Harry Potter is.
Well,
It happens.
Well, I tried to read Harry Potter and I just couldn't get past it. I think I got to some girl was Hermione. Hermione was trapped in a toilet with a ogre, and I was like, this is just not for me.
troll, but I understand.
At
But
any
yeah,
rate.
but yes, but that's another thing that we're talking about, the issues with the care and things like that, with the rollbacks that our dear president recently put through in regards to healthcare for the trans community. On top of that, you have Jerk Rawlings going through and using her giant platform to basically be a super turf. You got people still believing that being trans is a mental illness when it's not. It just, everything's just been piling up on top of everything. So
Yeah,
And as
this
a
whole idea of trying to create distinction between sex and gender and all this stuff, it's unless you're talking from a very scientific and technical standpoint, in which case you're even muddying the waters there. Who cares? What is it to you? This idea of there being no safe spaces, it's bollocks. Of course that's bollocks. Everyone knows it's not true. It's a smokescreen. Sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. And also going back to TERF, I personally prefer the term fart, which is feminism appropriating reactionary transphobe.
ooh,
I got to admit, I quite like that, but I did manage to sneak in a reference with TERF once, which was a little bit naughty, but I managed to, I was on a show with someone who was very similar, and we were discussing something around, and I just said, I can't remember what the person said. It was something about sort of meat and seafood or something like that, and I said surf and turf, sort of very pointedly, gesturing to myself and turf. So I managed to get that one through. But
Yeah.
Small
That
victories.
actually runs very similar to another joke that we hear specifically in feminist communities is the swerf and turf, which is the sex worker exclusionary radical feminists and the trans exclusionary
oh
ones.
man, it's because sex workers don't have it hard enough.
Right?
so I want to just go a little bit off the rail, off topic, but still on the science aspect of it, because you are a professional, and we generally
Okay.
don't get a lot of professionals to be able to explain parts of their trade in the community. Yes, we do have people that do their trades and explain things, but you would be someone that we'd like to talk about. COVID-19, all right? What is your thoughts from your perspective as a science communicator? How the virus and the reaction is being communicated? And if you could make a change on how it's communicated, what would you do?
I think you broke him.
Hello.
All right, we
Welcome
got
back.
you
Yay!
Sorry about that. I got so angry I actually pulled the cord out of my mic.
back.
You know,
That question
We
got you
don't
so
blame
angry.
you.
It got you. Awesome.
All right.
I'm
Let's start
gonna delete everything in between there. And just start from that point.
Okay. With COVID-19 and how it's been communicated, it largely depends on which country we're talking about. I think there are
Mm.
countries that have done a fantastic job. I have nothing but praise for New Zealand and how they've handled it. If we're talking about the UK and the US and Brazil in particular, it has been an absolute clusterfuck. I mean, it's been a category in how to do things wrong. People have died because of government incompetence in all of these countries. There's no question about that as far as I'm concerned. The misinformation that was initially given, particularly from some of the people in the administration, the confusing and double standards and uncertainty about exactly what the advice was. We saw that in the UK. There was a big scandal because one of the government advisors, a guy called Dominic Cummings, actually broke all the rules. He traveled the entire length of the country with COVID-19. He was infected, and then went into quarantine somewhere else. He broke all the quarantine ideas, the idea of self-isolation. He then took a trip out to a castle, which he claimed was to test his eyesight. I mean, it was all garbage, and huge scandal in the UK. But what Trump has been coming out with is an absolute nonsense. I mean, injecting bleach? What was that man thinking? Oh, well, of course he wasn't thinking. He was just brain farting. He was literally sort of, thoughts were coming in and straight it was going out of his mouth. But of course he doesn't have the mental capacity to actually have decent thoughts. And so you were just getting, shit goes in, shit goes out. That was horrific. The idea that, I mean, it was just madness. The WHO currently recommend that everyone wears masks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Donald Trump's reaction to the WHO was to stop funding the WHO. The people who are trying to save the world, and he's going, yeah, they're the bad guys. Listen to me, guys. It's utterly insane.
and on top of that, he's actually been saying that we should stop testing because then the numbers would go down.
I saw that, yeah. Funny that if you stop testing people, the number of people that are positive tests go down. That's what happens because you've got a lower. To be honest with you, the other thing that it ties into is the poor provision of US healthcare in general. Healthcare system is an absolute nightmare. It is a national shame, as far as I'm concerned, to have a healthcare system where people die because they cannot get treatment, cannot afford to have the bills for the rest of their life. That is disgusting. That is despicable.
You're absolutely right. And there's been a lot of call for single-payer healthcare for a long time now. Unfortunately, that particular option basically got gutted out of the Affordable Care Act, specifically because everybody's like, but that's communism.
Exactly. I mean, you've got this madness. There's so many things that have been just driving me up the wall with the United States at the moment. I mean, the one thing that
trust me, Bill and I both understand we live here.
Yeah, but I mean, you had people breaking essentially the Third Amendment, and it's funny, the people that were saying about the guns and we need the Second Amendment in case we need to rise up as a militia to protect us against the army. Literally, that was happening, and they didn't do a thing. It's funny; it was almost like they were using that as an excuse to keep their guns. What they really mean was we're using it to protect it against people that don't look like me.
Yep.
Pricks. North Carolina has been an absolute disgrace in terms of how it's handled with COVID. There are thousands dead because of poor governance. It boils down to poor governance, and there are so many different.
And it's actually kind of interesting because right now, especially with a lot of the protests and whatnot that were going on, a lot of the protesters were trying to social distance. They were wearing masks. They were doing everything they could specifically to respect all of these things around a pandemic as much as they could. And so, 2 weeks out, people are trying to blame, spiking cases on the protests when it's really a lot of people who are actually, going out, breaking shelter-in-place orders, breaking quarantine, specifically to go out and do the things that they normally do on a Memorial Day weekend.
Yep.
Well, precisely. This whole spiking cases tied with the protests, it's a false illusion. The people who've got these new cases, were they at the protests? They weren't. I bet they were out at shopping at the strip mall or whatever they do.
They were at the beach.
Mm-hmm. They were at the beach. And also, on a related note, I actually have to go get a test for COVID-19 tomorrow, specifically because I had a trip to the emergency room last week, and due to other factors, my doctor's like, you know what? You're kind of high risk because of these other things, this other guidance that I've received. I know some of it is bullshit, but I would rather have you take it than not. And I'm like, you know what? I'm totally okay with you having me go in specifically just to know. I gotta admit, I was personally scared to go into the emergency room last week because of what was going on with me, because I thought there was a chance that I could potentially put myself in a place where I would be at risk. And there are folks within my household who are higher risk than I am that I don't want to get sick.
I think it speaks volumes about people's character when they say things like, "Oh, it's going to be the old that die, or the ill." This concept of expendability. I mean, what? How do you get that logically? Of course, we need to do whatever we can to stop this and nip it in the bud. And it's a global phenomenon. I think one thing I would say is that the COVID pandemic probably wasn't preventable. I don't think that was ever going to be the case. It was always going to sort of drip out. Certainly, we could have mitigated it. It acted far, far sooner. And a delay that happened, particularly in the UK and particularly in the US, nothing short of a national scandal.
Absolutely, considering there have been communications specifically saying that the White House administration specifically knew about it in the beginning of January.
Of course it did. And I appreciate that there are nuances and balances and things like that, and you've got to sort of take into account economic crashes and all that kind of stuff. We talk about human lives, and we're talking about long-term impact. And when the dust settles, history is not going to judge Donald Trump and his administration kindly on this, or really anything. I'm just trying to think of something good that they've actually done. There must be something.
I think even the remote inkling of a good thing that may have happened was, I think it first came out of Trump's mouth about the idea of sending everybody a stimulus check, and that was it. And that was only one check. But at the same time, we had, I think it was Andrew Wang was the presidential candidate. I could be wrong. He was really pushing for the universal basic income anyway, a part of his platform for presidency.
She's supportive of universal basic income. It's funnily enough, actually, COVID-19 has one thing it will have a massive knock-on effect on is that no longer can any company say you can't work from home. Because
absolutely.
Everyone knows that's not the case. So there are so many homes and families that do not have a satisfactory internet provision, broadband, things like that. For too long, it's not been considered an essential service. I think that the pandemic has proved it is. So if anything, that should accelerate that. At least I hope it does. But yeah, the idea that you can't work from home, that you have to have a car, it's all garbage. And it's very clearly been proven that by the pandemic.
Yeah, and these conversations were already happening before the pandemic started. I, for one, was working from home 3 to 4 days a week, depending on the week. And now I'm working from home pretty much exclusively. And I can also work from multiple places all over the country, as long as I have an appropriate work device and access to the VPN. Like, this really kind of shakes the whole foundation of, going into an office and having to work in an office, at least for specifically intelligence workers, like people who are information workers specifically, as opposed to, there's always going to be a need for essential services. I have friends who are doing essential services during all of this and being extra careful about who, yeah. Yep. So but it's definitely changed a lot of the culture around where people need to be in order to work.
I mean, for example, with my office environment, one of the things that they basically recently said is that they're not even going to give us even a remote date of returning to announce that until sometime maybe later in August. And that's a maybe. We're going to be actually doing a survey tomorrow that we all have to fill out about our local areas, about our concerns and worries about coming back to work and working from home and things like that. And I don't think for a lot of the service that my company needs to do, I don't think we actually need to go into the office. Yes, just like your company, we have a mailroom because people have to mail us stuff, and that needs to get sorted and scanned and things like that. So there has to be people at the office. However, you could probably take my whole entire division and save on real estate fees and just have us all work from home.
Anyway, we're getting completely off track. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about? Because it's
completely off track.
It's like 2:30 in the morning now, and I really want to go to bed.
Let's go ahead and let Kit go to bed then, because I think I've covered the stuff that I want to cover. Actually, there is one more question I have for you, Kit. So you've got a book out. You're working on your PhD. You're probably gonna have your PhD here within the next few years. What's next for you?
So I've actually got another book that another 2 books that I'm working on. I've got a book that's a proper academic-y kind of one that's coming out a little bit end of the year, and then I'm working on a book on the science that goes into motor racing and NASCAR, Formula One, Formula E, but particularly looking at some of the advanced science stories, because some of the stuff that we're doing at the moment, and some of the stuff that we've got from Formula One and Formula E, you would never believe.
There is so much nerd shit in NASCAR. Damn.
And NASCAR is just full of stuff. But NASCAR is really interesting because it's what's called a stock system. So all the cars are exactly the same. And so the cheating, if you like, the technical kind of wizardry that goes on with that is absolutely fascinating. But I've been talking to Formula One teams who have designed transports for neonatal babies, preterm babies, to protect them, because they're so good at protecting drivers going around at 200 miles an hour. When transporting a baby, they can use the same technology. The aerodynamics that go on to motor racing cars are used in refrigerators in supermarkets. Sounds kind of frivolous, but by controlling the flow of air in a fridge, you can reduce its energy output by about 30 to 40%, which cuts massive amounts of emissions. So there's all these green technologies that you would never have thought of that have come out of motor racing. And so that's kind of what I'm looking at.
All right. Where can people find you?
So my website is kitchapman.co.uk. You can find me on Twitter at ChemistryKit. That's pretty much the main places.
All right. Well, we're going to go through and wrap it up.
I am sad I didn't tell the sex toy story, but that's okay. It's way too late for you there.
Oh yeah, I mean that's all on Twitter. If you want to know the sex story toy story, that's all on Twitter.
Yep. So go to Twitter, and also he put up a periodic table of Disney characters listing all the elements with Disney characters. It's an amazing read on Twitter. So go check that out too.
Gallium as Gaston, the giant French cock.
Absolutely. And Holmium, which is named after Stockholm, that's Beast, because Stockholm syndrome is what he gives Belle.
So to wrap things up, my name is Bill. I want to thank my special guest co-host Renee and our guest Kit, and we all have an X chromosome. So since Noel's not here to kick the bot out, I guess that's going to go to me.
Get out of here, Craig. We hate you.
Oh, thank you. I didn't want to go through and do it myself.
Hating on Craig was a time-honored tradition in Discord role-playing game I was in. Get out, Craig. We hate you.
Let's go. They call me Speed Rider, but never no heat hider. But I'm digital, fighting wars no one's hit to. Matrix Division Network System Point 2. Called the one, the Neo, the Novice, the Noose. Or Trinity will execute. Between the viral agents flagrant, engaged. No space income state to undertake. Making model which coddle the nature of humanity. Basic profanities into the insanity that's branded me. Give it up with the reloaded messaging. Broke it down between the test and blessing. But before I get lost in this train of lyrics, let me reverse to raise the solemn spirits. Getting weary of the revelation theory. Fabrications constructed from peaceful memory. Comparisons between the old and black queries. Fragmented delusions made up like you don't hear me. For Zion, we fight on. For Zion, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. For Zion, we fight on. For Zion, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. I give you 2 hearts and 2 lives. Through the clouds, we'll see the skies. The sun shines down on our faces before descending into hell's traces. We can't replace this. EMP's ready to be unleashed. Nebuchadnezzar, slipstreaming like a beast. Oracles architecting a congregated feast. String them up like a martyr and will know peace. Plot of pointers, don't see the message. Too busy, look at the cameras, judgmental dresses. The siblings crash at what could only be an epic, but this won't be regarded, cause the hands back it. No matter your opinion, machines pouring in. Guns blazing, Zion needs saving. Humanity craves it. On us, we can blame it. Life form tubes, babies wasted. Human embryos in a slave ship. In a slave ship. But down to the words, their bones, their purpose. Lift up the human spirit, the soul. It's worth it. For Zion, we fight on. For Zion, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. For Zion, we fight on. For Zion, Father, Son. Holy Ghost.
Now that you pass it, I think they getting bloated. They gas and they show it. Well, time to get reloaded. More Sonic than Neo and me and Alpha come and take this and make this so colorful. You think this was Animatrix? When you hear this style, yeah, you best go ahead and take a whiff. Because once we're done, you feel more blending than Agent Smith. Business by day, hacker by night, party mullet time. Slow it down before you stop. Bullet rhyme. Tried to take it, the world was fake-ish. Back in time, the machines had made this. Even if the world could get no faker, we got a crew, Morpheus, Trinity, and the Key Maker. Never fail to neglect through all the fun. There will always be a chosen one. If you got a high rank diploma, I'll disable you even if I fall into a coma. Coma. Coma.
Father, Son, Holy Ghost.